What is up? Welcome to another edition of the Fantasy Life Podcast. I am Marcus Grant, joined by Dwayne McFarland, fresh out of the bunker, having gone through a whole bunch of information and stats and data as he puts together the utilization report. And Dwayne, I would think after this week, with so many injuries, with guys changing places, utilization, I think, has to be a really important and maybe kind of a really confusing sort of thing to look at this week. I don't know. How are you feeling?
Yeah, absolutely. I even told Jordan this morning as I was trying to, dwindle down like what my key takeaways were going to be for the utilization report this week. I was like, man, I'm really having a hard time like cutting it down because there were so many because of injuries and things, but then also there were just so many close calls because a lot of these situations, they need context, right, to really understand them. And we'll work through several of them. But to your point, whenever you're looking through those things and you're like, okay, like which player are we going to recommend more, right? Or are these two players really equal? It just takes a lot of time and just sitting there and thinking through like what happened in the game, what was the game script like? It's not just as easy as looking at the players' numbers, it's looking at the context, right, of how the numbers came. And so I spent quite a bit of time trying to tease those things out and just figure out, okay, like what do we think is real? What do we think is fake? And I will be honest, like there's a few this week where it's kind of like, not sure. Not sure. We think it probably is this way, but it could be that. So and we'll be honest about those things as we go through them.
Absolutely. And we're going to definitely dive into some of those, especially some of these weird backfield situations that we've seen crop up in the last few weeks. We'll also do a mid-season check-in on a couple of players, as well as give you some ideas of players maybe you want to stash for the stretch run. We have hit the halfway point of the fantasy regular season, so things certainly turning up in a lot of leagues. But want to start with a couple of running backs who may be finding their way into RB1 territory. And let's start, Dwayne, with Kenneth Walker. We've talked about him a little bit the last couple of weeks after the unfortunate injury to Rashad Penny. Walker has stepped in and he has been great. 168 rushing yards, 2 touchdowns this past week against the Chargers. He has looked amazing. And considering how the Seahawks are using him, they're pretty much a one running back team. I don't see why he can't be an RB1 the rest of the way, unless your utilization tells me otherwise. It looks like he's full speed ahead right now.
No, I think he is a mid-range RB1 the rest of the way. So I think once you get past the names, at the very top of utilization, which we have to now include Josh Jacobs, Austin Eckler, Saquon Barkley, there's a few other guys, but once you get past that very tip-top group, Kenneth Walker is in play after that. And like, man, just you mentioned it. Like it's not just the utilization. He looks amazing. I will say from utilization perspective, over the last couple of weeks, we talked about they may not be afraid of him on passing downs. We talked about how even before the injury with Rashad Penny, that the long down and distance work, he was already getting some of those snaps, which is it's a key down because you face a lot of blitzes. And so the coaching staff has to trust you to not get the quarterback killed. And we saw him get 46% of those in week 6. And we even mentioned, once that happens, if they trust you in that situation, we might see you get the 2-minute offense, which is really the more valuable snaps for fantasy, because that's when Austin Eckler, we've talked about in the past, turns from having a 5-target game into having a 10-target game. Right. And so Kenneth Walker this last weekend, Marcus, 100% of the Seahawks 2-minute offense. So he didn't end up with a target last weekend, but that is still a very, very, very positive sign. So there's a chance, even when Travis Homer gets back, that we see Kenneth Walker's role just continue to expand. And man, like 0.39 missed tackles forced per attempt. The NFL average is 0.17. So he's more than, doubling that number up. If we look at his explosive rush rate, 18%, the league average is 10.5%. So those are carries of 10 plus yards or more. And then yards after contact, 3.96. The average for the NFL over the last 3 seasons is 2.93. So he's blowing everything away, like from an efficiency on the ground, and now starting to see more and more work in the passing game. If he starts getting those targets, which we've seen, the targets per route run have not been bad, a little bit lower now. Last week he was at like 22%. The season-long numbers is 16% now. But if that number is around 20% and he's seeing the passing down work, wow, like he would then have a chance to be in the top 3 running backs if this efficiency continues.
You talk about the targets too, and yes, he didn't get any on Sunday, but I also noticed that he ran quite a bit of routes, so he was out there, and I think that is certainly encouraging, because if that continues, you do know that target share is going to come. He'll get those opportunities, and that only boosts his potential value. In Jacksonville, what started as the James Robinson show with a little bit of Travis Etienne kind of featured in has become completely the Travis Etienne show. I thought maybe we would see a little bit of Robinson last week. He played just 11 snaps, I believe was the number. This is completely Travis Etienne's backfield. And now, I mean, are you thinking is he in the range of an RB1 at this point too?
Yeah, well, I mean, we were already going to be talking about Travis Etienne as someone whose utilization profile last weekend looked like an RB1, but I was only going to move him up to mid-range RB2. He started off the season as a mid-range or as a high-end RB2 for me. He had worked his way down to high-end RB3 just because, the way everything had worked out over those first few weeks. We weren't for sure if it was going to be game script or dependent or what, but he was going to end up being back in the mid-range RB2. That was before the trade. That was before we woke up. Well, we didn't wake up. Like yesterday, we found out, right, that James Robinson had been moved to the Jets to help replace Breece Hall and the injury that he had suffered, which is a season-long ACL and meniscus injury. So now it's kind of a no-brainer. Now it's like, okay, we have Snoop Connor. He could come in and help ease the load a little bit, maybe on early downs. JaMycal Hasty is really more of a running back on the archetype of Travis Etienne, right? He's really more of a pass-catching kind of guy. So there's really not anyone else right now on the roster that can even challenge Etienne, for the rushing attempt. So I'm not hesitating. I mean, I moved him into low end RB1 territory. He's been out there all season long on the passing down stuff. And so in PPR and half PPR especially, right? Like that's where Etienne belongs. If you're playing in a standard league, you can make an argument you play it a little bit more conservative, but there's really not going to be a scenario, unless you're playing in like a 3-team league, where he's not going to be in one of your starting positions, either your RB2 or your flex, heading into week 8. So yeah, it is all wheels up for Etienne. And I do want to say, like earlier in the season with Etienne, I was seeing the utilization, come around for him. But one thing we had talked about is, the efficiency hadn't been there. We just talked about all those things with Kenneth Walker. He didn't have those. But over the last several weeks, Etienne has really been playing better. It does make you wonder if he's really just now getting fully recovered from the season-ending injury that he suffered last preseason. But missed tackles forced per attempt, 0.25. Again, the league average is 0.17. Yards after contact, not quite the god that Kenneth Walker is at 3.96, but 3.07 is still well above the league average. And then his explosive rush rate, 15%. And again, the NFL average is 10.5 there. So he's above the league average in all of the metrics that we look at that try to help us isolate running back talent away from just the environment that they play in. So a lot of things to be really excited about with Travis Etienne. There's a chance you could still call him a buy low, just depending, on the league you're in. Most people have heard the news are going to be super excited, right? Because you didn't get Travis Etienne for cheap, but just depending on, who has him in your league, you still may kick the tires on him because he hasn't had a blow up game yet. Some people really care more about fantasy points, and that's just what they, gravitate towards, especially if you don't listen to a show like this where you get all this kind of information. But his highest game on the season it was last weekend at 18.9 in a PPR. So it's not like he's had a 30, 40-point blow-up game that would just make someone feel like he's completely untradeable. So something to consider.
Yeah, definitely something to consider. But as you mentioned, with James Robinson not there, a guy who was already getting the lion's share of the opportunities, probably going to get even more. And you're right. It is because the end result has not necessarily been spectacular. He hasn't had one of those Austin Eckler type games yet. I think maybe the word hasn't quite gotten out. But, when you're sitting around here and you're looking at guys like Alvin Kamara and Najee Harris and Aaron Jones, who have been true disappointments that people probably invested a lot of draft capital in, a guy like Travis Etienne could be a really valuable piece over the next few weeks, the next couple of months as we get down toward the fantasy playoffs there. But now, as we mentioned, James Robinson getting traded to the New York Jets. He, for now, at least, is filling in part for Breece Hall, who's gone for the rest of the season. Michael Carter is still there. How do you see this shaking out? Is this going to be truly a two-headed attack, or is this, James Robinson is kind of there for insurance and this is Carter's backfield?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I don't think we can say for sure that we know the answer. What we do know is that the Jets have completely changed their identity since they've gone to Zach Wilson at quarterback. They want to run the football. They want to lean on their defense, which has played pretty well. They want to establish leading scripts. They want to win close margin games. They are not there to try to be in a shootout. So I think there's going to be work for both backs. How the pecking order ultimately, kind of shakes out, I think that's what the question is. But I could very easily, and get your thoughts here, Marcus, I could very easily see James Robinson slotting in to take care of most of that early down work. Michael Carter is a really talented back. He played well last year, but but I'm not sure how the Jets feel about him as being more than a change of pace. I could be wrong. I like the talent profile. He's very good in the receiving game. So I think that we will continue to see Michael Carter as the lead back in the passing game. I just don't know that we're going to see him get maybe over 40% of the rushing attempts, which would still be okay. Both players get an upgrade, honestly, on the news because Robinson was trending in the wrong direction. Etienne was taking over, to your point. Well, now you land somewhere where we've seen them already show us they prefer a platoon, really, between their backs. We know they want to be a run-heavy team. I think James Robinson really fits the mold of being the guy that handles those early down, carries. And he could see up to 60% of those. I think that's in his range of outcomes. I would say right now, going into especially this next week, I would probably lean more to Michael Carter for that first game. But I think after that, we'll probably see something where maybe 50-55% of the rushing attempts go to James Robinson, 35-45% go to Michael Carter. Could see a sprinkle, right, of Ty Johnson, and mostly seeing Carter out there on the passing downs. I think that makes both of those guys viable as long as the Jets can keep the game script, intact. In games where they're going to, and this is going to happen because Zach Wilson's terrible. Zach Wilson could have easily thrown like another 3 interceptions last weekend. Like he was just doing stuff that I don't know that the coaching staff will be able to stick with him much longer, especially if they really think they're going to win this year. And right now they've got a good record. Like he's just, running all over the place, throwing the ball straight into the middle of the field, doing everything like that, even if you played peewee football, you were coached not to do. Like Zach Wilson's still doing those things. And so those kind of things are eventually they're going to trip up the Jets. It's going to put them into trailing scripts. And I think those scenarios is definitely Michael Carter's going to be more insulated than James Robinson in those kind of game scripts, because then I think you're just not going to see James Robinson on the field. Kind of what we had started to see, with the Jaguars. When the Jaguars were in close games or trailing, we just didn't see James Robinson anymore. I think that could still be the case in New York.
Well, and I think the Jets I think they came into this season with the idea that it would be a closer split between Breece Hall and Michael Carter. I think it got to a point where Hall was playing so well, it just got hard to keep him off the field. And so you saw Carter's role sort of diminish at that point. I don't know that you're going to have such a big gap between Robinson and Carter. The thing, at least in the short term, that would concern me about James Robinson was the thing that Doug Peterson talked about after the game last week, saying that he had some knee soreness, and that was part of the reason we didn't see him on the field as much. And you talk about Etienne sort of finally maybe getting back to health after his injury. You do wonder, because Robinson came back way ahead of, I think, a lot of people's expectations, that maybe he's still sort of trying to get healthy as well. And, how much is that going to factor into what he can do in New York, how much he can be used? But the opportunity.
Yeah, I think that's real. And I think it's a good call out. Like we do see these players coming back from major injury, they can deal with compensatory issues, right? Yeah. As they try to make up for things. Like, look, I'm getting older in life. I even noticed, like, when I hurt one thing, like, and then, I try to compensate for it, like in the way you may walk or something for a week. And then the next thing you're like, crap, now like my left quad hurts or something, so these guys are out there playing NFL football. You can only imagine, you naturally kind of gravitate to trying to protect. Your body does that. So yeah, I think that could be a factor. I do wonder like how much of that is true. It was interesting. Why would Doug Peterson even come out and say that if you're trying to trade James Robinson? Like, is that, like you got on a dunce cap? Like, what are you doing? Or did he just know it was happening and he didn't want to say anything bad about James Robinson, and he's going to have the reporters asking him about Etienne's role, and really the answer that he didn't want to give at the time was, yeah, we're trying to trade him. We didn't want him to get hurt. Like, I don't know. I have no clue where the truth lies in that, but I think it's a good call out by you.
Yeah, no, it's definitely was sort of weird, especially because Robinson hadn't been on any injury reports leading up to the game, and then all of a sudden, like, he's got knee soreness. And I'm not doubting that was the case. It just sort of,
I kind of am, but I'm not either. It's like, I don't know. I don't know what the truth is. Like, you could tell me both narratives and they would both make sense to me.
Right. Exactly. That's sort of where we are right now. Let's look at some of the bigger utilization pictures though across the league. And we got a number of names here. We probably won't get to all of them. We'll do as many as we can. Start with Justin Fields though, who, the beginning of the year, we're still trying to figure out who he is. And it was a rough start to the year, but the last 2 weeks have looked a little better. And then Monday night against the Patriots was maybe a tour de force. That might've been the best game I've seen Justin Fields play all year. I think somebody tweeted that, there's something about him that I guess, rainstorms seem to unlock his potential, because he played in the rain in week 1 against the 49ers, looked good, played in a misty kind of rainy day against the Patriots in Foxborough, looked good again there too. But the long and short of it though, Dwayne, is that Justin Fields is starting to figure some things out, even in an offense that doesn't necessarily help him out with weapons around him.
Yeah, there are a lot of things right now to like about Justin Fields. Number one, he is averaging 10.3 rushing attempts per game over the last 4 games. So we've seen the Bears have told us all season long that really the run game is their identity, but they've really leaned into that hardcore. Now, last night, they actually trailed. This is the first game. This is crazy. Week 7. In week 1, they led by 4+ points on 6 plays. Last night they led by that over 30 times, and that's the only they've not led at any other point in the league. So last night you saw the game script of all game scripts, where everything worked out perfectly. What they want their identity to be, they had the lead, so they could just continue to do it. But they decided to run the ball on 61% of plays. That is insane. The NFL average, even when leading by 4+ points or more, is like 50%. And they were doing it 61%, so 11% above the NFL average over the last 3 seasons. And so that's still a positive, though. We know that they want to run the ball. They've shown us that, even whether they're in a close game, whether they're trailing, it doesn't matter. This is what the Bears want to do. But the other thing that was a really big, takeaway for me, Marcus, was the fact that he saw 28% of the designed rushing attempts. Last week, we talked about David Montgomery. We talked about Khalil Herbert. We talked about the hot hand approach that Matt Eberflus had come out and said, oh, we're going to go with the hot hand. We're going to use the hot runner. We didn't know that Justin Fields was one of the 3 people they meant. And that's really what happened. Last night, you saw David Montgomery at a season low as far as, in the games he's been healthy, as far as his snaps, as well as his rushing attempts. And it wasn't because Khalil Herbert took them away. Khalil Herbert had 28% of the rushing attempts. The week before, he had 26%. Most people, when they look at it, though, they're like, oh, man, look at Khalil Herbert. He had a big spike in rushing plays. That's just because they led the whole game, and they ran the ball all the time. The player that stole the rushing attempts away from David Montgomery was Justin Fields. 28% of the design rushing attempts went to him. If you look at the top quarterbacks in the league in that area, they're Lamar Jackson, who sits at 25% right now on the season in that stat. If you look at Jalen Hurts, he's right around that territory as well. So if we can see Justin Fields, if that continues, and that was the thing, honestly, that I wrote about, before the season, the path to Justin Fields, like being a lock as a top 12 quarterback, is them using him 20 to 25% on design rushing plays. And they have not done that. Now, he already leads the league in scramble rate at 18%. So he was getting his carries in spite of the coaching staff not using him in the design running game. And so if this sticks, we're going to see a lot of games where you're going to see Justin Fields between 10 and 14 rushing attempts, in a game, between his scrambles, between the design run looks, and between the fact that we know that they want to remain run heavy. So I'm looking at Justin Fields right now. Go ahead and call him a high-end QB2. But there's a real chance that this turns into somebody that we can't really keep out of the quarterback one conversation, because you and I both know, like, rushing is the cheat code. We've seen it. We've seen it with Tim Tebow. We've seen it when Taysom Hill has stepped in. These guys can't throw NFL passes. And they have come through with big fantasy performances, all because of the run game. Justin Fields, I think there's still a lot of questions about what he can do in the passing game. He only threw for 179 yards last night. Now, they didn't need to throw a lot, but he hasn't thrown for a lot of yards. Like, he's only on pace for 2,500 passing yards. That's terrifying. But he could also be a guy that could have a shot at, 800-900 yards rushing on the ground.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I was looking at, too, with him, because look at his passing numbers. He has just about 30 more passing yards than Cooper Rush, who, is no longer a starter, was basically a stopgap for the Cowboys. But because he can run the football, because he is among the league leaders, at least among quarterbacks in rushing, he does have that upside every week. And it's sort of, to a lesser extent, it's kind of what we saw with Jalen Hurts. And I always hate that we keep coming back to that as like, hey, man, we're not sure what you are as a passer, but you were really good as a runner. That's kind of become, Jalen Hurts has become the shorthand for that. But even Jalen Hurts last year, I think about this time, still had about 1,700 passing yards, whereas, you got Fields just
Jalen only threw for 3,200 yards last year and 16 passing touchdowns. So when you hear me say he's on pace for 2,512, it only takes a little bitty tweak and a little bit more efficiency that all of a sudden he's having a Jalen Hurts year. That could happen. So yeah, I think that's a great point by you, and that's actually that would be the season that I would look at. And I know it feels like it's just a recency thing, but they're very similar in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm. And again, it's sort of what we were hoping for with Trey Lance before he unfortunately got hurt, and it seems to be what is in the works with Justin Fields. And I just hope that Luke Getsy and that Bears coaching staff sort of plays to his strengths more, as you mentioned, the design runs, getting him out of the pocket, letting him sort of move around and do things, because I think that makes him better. I think that makes that entire Bears offense better. So maybe
quick question, Marcus, before we move on. Let's name the quarterbacks real quick that we would start Justin Fields over. Or maybe let's just say here's the line where after this name, you probably need to consider starting him. Like I think, I'm still going to keep Tom Brady above him. You know, Brady struggled, but they're still throwing the ball plenty. I still feel like Brady is going to get on track. I would still go ahead and include Dak ahead of him.
Yeah.
I think you could make an argument that Geno Smith has shown enough that we should still consider him over Fields. But if he's going to be without DK Metcalf, that hurts for Geno Smith. But I think that's around the mark where I start saying, okay, I would consider Justin Fields. I would start now. He plays Dallas this weekend, but he just played the Patriots, the team that is supposed to just riddle young quarterbacks. And look what he did because of the running game. Now the Patriots killed themselves getting behind, and that helped enable, the running game. But I think once you're past those names I just gave you, like I would start him. I would very much consider him over Aaron Rodgers. I would start him for sure over Russell Wilson. I would start him over Matthew Stafford. Who are some of the other names? Like I'm forgetting here. Like I think Kirk Cousins. He's almost a coin flip at this point now. With Kirk Cousins,
that's
Derek
about
Carr.
the line. Kirk Cousins, I think, is definitely on the line there. I mean, start him over Tannehill. Start him over, in either of the Saints quarterbacks.
There's only like 9 or 10 names then for sure that we would start over Justin Fields. Then it becomes a conversation.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think that's where we are now. The trick is for him to sustain it, for the Bears offense to sustain it. But I think what we saw of him on Monday night suggests that he has sort of taken that step forward. That's just a
3
matter
top
of
12 finishes in a row. So I mean, he's been pretty consistent. That can change, but that's we live in a world of small samples. In fantasy football, and right now, Justin Fields is hot. So
it's a series of 17, 18 1-week samples, basically, is what we're sort of working
exactly.
with. We try to make sense out of it however we can. Kareem Hunt has not had the fantasy season I think a lot of people would have anticipated, and now there's talk that he could be traded from the Cleveland Browns. If you have him, is it worth holding on to? If you're looking to add somebody, is it worth maybe taking the swing and hoping that he gets traded to a better situation?
Yeah, absolutely. You should hold on to him. There's no way I'm cutting Kareem Hunt, right now. Number 2, I think you should actually be trying to go and trade for Kareem Hunt right now. And there's a few reasons for that. Number 1, his utilization has not changed from last year. He's still getting all the long down and distance work. He's still getting all the 2-minute offense. Guess what? He's gotten 30% of the rushing attempts. Last year, before he got hurt, in the games where he and Nick Chubb played together, guess what percentage of the rushing attempts he had for the Browns? 30%. His role has not changed. So unless you think that Kareem Hunt has suddenly become washed at the age of 27, despite not really having a heavy workload over the last several years, unless that's your belief, on that merit alone, like you should be buying Kareem Hunt. So if we think Kareem Hunt is at least still a decent talent, I bet he's still a top 12. That's where I would put my chip. He's been top 6 talent-wise over the last 3 years. Like destroys all these things we talk about with Kenneth Walker, all these other guys, that we've got. Breece Hall before he got hurt that we were so excited about. Kareem Hunt has been doing these things for 2 or 3 years. Like he just so happened to play behind maybe the best pure rusher in all of the NFL and Nick Chubb. So when I look at Kareem Hunt, number 1, we know the utilization is there. The drop-off has really been in his targets per route run. He has typically been around 22% over the last 3 seasons. That number has dropped to 15%. And I think some of that you could say, well, you have Amari Cooper. That's really the most target competition he's had. But there's still room for, Kareem Hunt to get some of these targets. And again, we do believe that targets are, created. They can be a little more designed for running backs. But I think that could very much just be variance, man. It could just very much be variance. And we could easily next week be like, wow, Kareem Hunt just had 7 targets. And it could, David Njoku has a high ankle sprain. He's going to miss a couple of weeks, so we could get a bump just from that alone because the next guy in line is Donovan Peoples-Jones, and he's really a down-the-field type target. Now, he's been working a little bit more intermediate lately, but he's only at a 19% target share, so there's still room in the Browns offense, which is heavily condensed. There's no one else after the top 3 guys getting anything. There's no one else getting any targets. So there's still room there for Kareem Hunt to pick up those targets as long as we don't think that he's washed. And then you mentioned the other thing, the trade rumor, man. The rumor mill is swirling right now around Kareem Hunt. We could at any moment get news that suddenly makes Kareem Hunt an RB1. If he goes to Buffalo, it will be like the Bermuda Triangle. You'll never hear from Devin Singletary again. You won't even know that he's alive. Like his family members will be calling authorities, like wondering where is Devin Singletary. He's not going to touch the field. Kareem Hunt is 10 times better than Devin Singletary. If he goes to the Eagles, as good as Miles Sanders has looked this year, I would bet he would force Miles Sanders into about a 20-30% of the snaps, and he would take everything else. Behind a great line, behind an offense that's scoring a lot of points, he could score 15 rushing touchdowns in a matter of the rest of the season, in an offense like that. So it just depends on where he lands, but almost certainly he's going to have less competition than Nick Chubb, one of the best running backs in the league. There are some places that if he went, like it would suck, like if he got traded and you're like, oh man, Tennessee with Derrick Henry, like something like that could happen. But still, like as long as you still believe in him as a talent, like he's still going to have outs wherever he lands, but most likely he's going to be in a better situation than what he's in right now in Cleveland. And even if he doesn't get moved, there's so many outs for him to get there. His utilization alone being one of them. And so, yeah, I'm absolutely in. And he's the kind of guy I love, Marcus. I try to get him as a throw-in. You don't even let people know that the guy you're targeting in the trade is Kareem Hunt, right? It's like, hey, I got Deontay Foreman over here. He just ran for 100 yards. I see you don't even have an RB2. They have Kareem Hunt. You don't have an RB2. I don't really need one, but I mean, I'll take your 4th round pick next year and give me Kareem Hunt. Like that's the kind of deal that I like to, and somebody's like, oh man, guy that just ran for 120 yards, Deontay Foreman. Yeah, Dwayne, you idiot. I'll take that trade. And then, 3 days later, they're looking at you going, you MFer.
Yeah. But, to your point, though, about whether or not you think he's washed, I think the fact that there is, at least what I anticipate to be a robust market for Kareem Hunt's services suggests to me that NFL teams don't think he's washed, that he's got something left. And it's been really nice the last couple of years to see that, the Browns had he and Nick Chubb, and both were productive. This year, as you mentioned, the target share has not been there. It's been narrowly funneled basically through Amari Cooper and David Njoku with a little bit of DPJ sprinkled in. But I think if he goes somewhere else, then Kareem Hunt goes back to, I know you like to talk about archetypes, right? He goes back to sort of closer to that Austin Eckler CMC kind of archetype that
Marcus,
that
speaking the truth.
Kansas City.
I love it, man. Yes, the archetype. And here's the other thing real quick on the archetype. Guys that catch passes can also remain viable longer in their careers. Mm-hmm. So think back to your Marshall Faulk. Now he's a great player, but think back to a lot of guys that can catch passes. That insulates them from the downfall. Matt Forte would be another really good example. At the end of Matt Forte's career, like he was not really a good running back anymore, but he was still really good in the passing game, and that kept him viable in fantasy. And again, you got to be in the right format. You need to be in a PPR or a half PPR format. It can still help you in standard because catches turn into yards as well. But in those formats, man, like there's a big buffer here for a complete faceplant in the talent department for Kareem Hunt.
So we'll see what happens with that. Keep an eye on Kareem Hunt because the trade deadline is just a few days away. So we'll see if the Browns can get something done there.
Make your move now. You got to
make your move now. Absolutely. Before it's too late. There was some news over the weekend when the Chiefs said they were going to make Isaiah Pacheco a starter. Now, the caveat to that was that Clyde Edwards-Helaire was still going to have a role in the offense, but you had a lot of people rushing to either pick up Pacheco or crowing that they were able to get him, a couple weeks in advance. And then it turned out that Jerick McKinnon was the guy that got all the opportunity. So I don't know, is this Andy Reid trolling? I tweeted out the screenshot from the insurance commercial where it's Andy Reid drawing mustaches on a sleeping passenger. And I felt like that was sort of everybody who rushed out to get Isaiah Pacheco. Is there any rhyme or reason to the utilization going on in Kansas City?
I think Pacheco should be rostered in absolutely every league. It did not work out this weekend as being, oh my God, everything went to Pacheco. But the fact that he's already surpassed Clyde Edwards-Helaire, which he did, it was close, but he started the game. He played drive number 1 and drive number 3, which have typically gone to Edwards-Helaire. Edwards-Helaire got a few snaps on those drives, but it was mostly Pacheco. And Edwards-Helaire didn't really get much, his work came more as the closer, which used to be Pacheco's role. So we're still on a 3-way committee, but I still take it as a positive, Marcus. Like this is a guy that no one expected to really do anything as a very late round NFL pick. And now he's coming in here and he's already surpassed Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Now we're going into a bye week. We know what can happen for rookies on bye weeks. We could very easily come out of this thing and be like, wow, where's Clyde Edwards-Helaire? I don't see him at all. Like if suddenly we got Pacheco at even just 50% of the rushing attempts, which I think is his path, because you mentioned Jerick McKinnon. Jerick McKinnon last week, yeah, he outsnapped the guys, but his utilization didn't change. His utilization was the exact same it's been. His 40% just looked better because the other two were splitting more. right? So before it had really been more Edwards-Helaire and Jarrett McKinnon, and then the third guy was Pacheco. This last week, everybody was a little closer, and so it just made it look like McKinnon was the lead guy. His role was really still the same. Now he had all the passing down work, but Pacheco, like his path to value is getting to, where he gets, Clyde Edwards-Helaire pushed down to like that 10%, 15% rushing attempt range. And, he's keeping 55% of the rushing attempts, getting all the carries inside the 5. If he can do that, like in the Kansas City offense, like he's still going to have a chance to be, an RB2. And so Pacheco's a guy you want to be careful with about as far as, getting him in your lineups. That was the danger this last weekend. Hearing the news that Pacheco had been named the starter and going after him was the right move. Putting him immediately into your lineup was the move that I think deserves the most scrutiny. And that's like what I look back at my process, like, because I think I ended up putting him at like RB 23, 24, right there as a low end RB2. And I still feel okay about it, but I did know that it could still very well, even though he was quote unquote the starter, still end up, as the guy that, was in a 3-way committee. And that's what we saw. So I think it's kind of a sum of, you're correct in one way, which is, it's still really this committee, but I think it's also right to have him on a roster. He shouldn't be free, in my opinion, anywhere in any kind of league. Even in shallow leagues, I would be finding a way to get a guy like Pacheco onto my roster, just because if it does break your way, and remember, a lot of these committees are just committees until they're not.
Mm-hmm.
We all thought that Josh Jacobs was going to be in a committee this year. We just knew it. Oh, we got Josh McDaniels. We got a really great, who was that gave us? Was it Kyle Fantasy Football Recon? Hit us up on Twitter for our request last week, Marcus, of how do you remember Josh McDaniels?
Right.
It's because we got an S in the word Josh.
Yes.
McDaniels. So thank you. Mike does not have an S.
Thank you, Kyle.
McDaniel. We appreciate you, Kyle. We love you. So yeah, I think you got to have Pacheco on a roster just because of the upside. If all of a sudden we get a situation like Josh Jacobs where, just kidding, I kind of like this guy the most. If that happens in Kansas City, man, oh, wow. Even if he's just, again, half of it, like it's going to be really good for Pacheco. I think the other thing is they're just signaling. They're moving on. Clyde Edwards-Helaire is not, he's just been bad. He ranks number 7 right now in rushing attempts above expectation over on Next Gen. So it's not worth giving Clyde Edwards-Helaire a lot of looks. He just doesn't do a lot with them.
Yeah, we've been asking for a reliable, consistent running back in Kansas City, right? I mean, we got the quarterback, we had the tight end, we had the wide receiver. Although look, maybe there's some worth talking about Juju too, about what he's done the last couple of weeks. But the one thing we were missing was a running back that we knew we could count on. We hoped it was Clyde Edwards-Helaire. It didn't really work out that way. I looked at last week though, and everybody says, well, Pacheco's the starter, and I thought about it sort of in baseball terms, right? Where now teams are going with less of starters and more of openers. And I'm like, this feels like a week where Isaiah Pacheco is not really the starter as much as he's the opener. And we're going to see some other guys work in there. So I'm with you. I definitely think he should be added. If he's out there, go get him. But, until we get some more clarity, I think you can fit him as the opener there.
Yeah. Sorry, I was just going to say he's available 51% of the time right now. As of tomorrow morning, that number will be different.
It will absolutely be different by the time we get to the next day there. Let's get to some wide receivers because DeAndre Hopkins came back, and he came back in a big way. First off, he started the day with an amazing hype video saying, "Don't call it a comeback," which if you do that, you have to go out and play well, right? You can't put out a hype video like that and then come up with 3 catches for 20 yards or something. He didn't. But maybe more interesting for me, Dwayne, is the way they moved him around. I mean, I know we always joke about Cliff Kingsbury putting his main receiver on the left side. It seemed like they were willing to move Nuke around, which to me makes him potentially even more dangerous down the stretch.
Yeah, they moved him around a little bit. Like they weren't hyper creative. He was still pretty much on an island. But man, we've seen this in the past from Kyler. He will have these games where it is like he is just, he gets a tractor beam and it is just on Nuke Hopkins. And that's what we saw. 50% target share to Hopkins. So, I mean, obviously that's not sustainable, but 50% makes me feel pretty good about, well, we could probably see 25% per week. We can cut that in half, still be okay. A lot of people were really concerned about Hopkins. He's in his age 30 season. And there were concerns that really, was he hitting a cliff last year? Even if we account for all the time, that he missed and we neutralize things and just go on a targets per route run. So only the time he was on the field. 18%, which was a big drop off from where he had been in 2019 and 2020 at 27%. So the fantasy community, besides the fact that he was suspended, and a lot of people also inserting their own narrative around, well, he was on PEDs, now he's going to be off of them. We don't, you guys aren't doctors, like give it a break. Like, and we don't know what they're using the PEDs for. Is a lot of times it's recovery from an injury, things like that, and sometimes it's just a mistake, right? Around something they didn't think that they thought they could be taking, or a doctor or someone they trust tells them, or even sometimes the teams, so I was just super impressed to see him come out and put up the big target share. Now, it was a depleted Saints secondary, to be fair. You did not have Marshawn Lattimore. They lost another corner, Bradley Roby, pretty early in the game. And at that point, they just knew that nobody there could guard, Hopkins. And that was pretty clear to me. But still, like, that's something. All he can do is go out there and dominate, the competition that you put in front of him. But I think this first data point tells us that last year, that 18%, because the question that I always had thrown out was, look, he hurt his shoulder in week 1 last year, and he was pretty much a decoy for the next 2 weeks. Then he came back and he had a nice game or two. Then he hurt his hamstring, and he tried to gut through some of that like he normally does. He ended up getting shut down for a little bit. Then when he came back from that, he hurt the MCL, eventually was shut down for the year. So he was never healthy last year. Now, sometimes these arguments work out. Sometimes they don't. We were in the same boat with Allen Robinson. We didn't know. We're like, well, he's kind of on the edge of being old, but he's not at a cliff age yet, where you just expect him just completely fall off. But it didn't work with Allen Robinson. Turns out that he probably was washed. Now we look at Nuke Hopkins, it was really the opposite. And to be fair, Hopkins has been a much better player, right? Hopkins has been, one of the best receivers in the NFL for the last 10 years. Allen Robinson's been really good, but Hopkins has been one of the top 3 to 5 over that stretch of time. So it's also a little bit of a different talent profile, but I think this all wheels up for Hopkins. And while we don't have Marquise Brown, like, I don't know, what's the lowest you can rank him without Marquise Brown in the lineup? Like, I don't feel like you can make him less than like a high-end wide receiver 2 heading into this week.
Yeah, no, I think if he's going to, again, not going to get 50% of the targets every week, but he is going to get a lot. We know that, as you mentioned, Kyler Murray likes to lean on him a little bit. So he's easily in the top 15. Depending on kind of what your situation is, but wide receiver 2 is worst case scenario, I think.
Starting in any format, probably.
Yeah.
I don't see a way where he's on a bench pretty much anywhere.
No, I can't imagine. And part of it is because if you drafted him, you've been waiting a while, so you're just itching to put him in your lineup. But also just because of the situation, and how he's going to get used in this offense, I think has something to do with it. Which, does this mean that Rondale Moore is he back to the bench now? Does he have any value anymore?
Yeah, I think that Rondale's still fine. I mean, players are going to have bad games. Like, the main thing with Rondale is the utilization is still there. Like, he's seeing plenty of routes. He worked on the outside. He worked on the inside this last week. So until Marquise Brown is back, I don't think Rondale is a guy that I'm going to change my expectations on too much, because really, yeah, Hopkins had this 50% game. But really, I mean, Marquise Brown had already been dominating targets, and we had still seen Rondale manage to be a viable low-end wide receiver 3, high-end wide receiver 4. I think he's still going to be in that category. I still look at him as a playmaker that we haven't seen, a lot of the big plays from yet. And I think those things could still come. So I'm going to keep him where he's at, right now. So it's really, it's Hopkins, it's Rondale Moore, and it's Zach Ertz, right? Those are your primary passing game targets for the Cardinals. Once we get Marquise Brown back, I think that is when the equation will change. Because if he continues to really exceed expectations, and then Hopkins is still rolling, there's not going to be anything left for Rondale Moore at that point. That's when it's going to be challenging. Until then, I would keep my expectations in alignment, with where we've been.
Let's go from Rondale to Wandale Robinson, who we've talked about this Giants
Good transition
pass catching group. Thanks. We talked about this Giants pass catching group, and the fact that there's no one there that is consistently commanding a decent target share. But if there's anybody that's worth paying attention to, it seems to be Wandale Robinson, who he saw his snap share jump pretty significantly between week 6 and 7. The routes run are there. If there's anybody that Daniel Jones is looking at fairly consistently, it seems to be him. I don't know if this Giants offense has one of those big blow up passing games in it particularly, but it does seem like if you're going to sort of bank on anybody there in New York, not named Saquon, then it seems like right now Wandale Robinson is that guy.
Yeah, I think the guy that we comped him to last week still fits. I think it's Jacoby Myers, right? You got a guy that's probably going to lead the team in targets. You got a passing offense you're not that excited about. But you can probably play this player as your wide receiver 3 every week. And in a PPR format, that's going to at least mean 10 points. If you score a touchdown in a week, you're going to get 20 out of Wandale. Now, I do think there's a little bit of upside here with Wandale because he's a second-round pick. He's still a rookie. We don't know for sure everything that we have with him because Jakobi Meyers, he is a great slot receiver. He's really good at getting open. That's his thing. But he's not a down-the-field threat. He's not a great run-after-the-catch threat. There's a chance Wandale could still have one of those other components to his game. And if he does, that's kind of the key that opens up a potential higher ceiling to Wandale. So we never want to, this early in a player's career, box them in too much, right, into what we think they're going to be. I think so far, everything we've seen matches 100% of the description that you gave, right? He's working from the slot 77% of the time. His average depth of target is not very high. It's a 4.6. That usually leads you to, okay, maybe we could have a really good season out of a player like that. Would be back in the day when you're in a really good offense like New England, you have a Wes Welker, right? You can have Julian Edelman, right? Would be another. We're just gonna talk about all the Patriots.
All these Patriots,
Jakobi Meyers,
yeah.
But again, you don't have Brady, right? You've got Daniel Jones, and you've got a team that really just wants to manage very narrow margins to win close games. They don't want to make mistakes, but that kind of fits with Robinson too, because if you're throwing underneath, throwing to the slot receiver, a lot of those things, those are your safer throws, So I feel really good about Robinson as a wide receiver 3. I think there's still a little bit of upside, right? That could still come. We could surprise ourselves. So I would never be in the boat of being, because I've seen some, on social media, Wandale's great, but, there's no upside. We can't say that yet. I agree overall, the situation would, and what we know so far would say that there's probably not a ton of upside. But even then, where are you finding wide receiver 3s just sitting there on the waiver wire that you feel pretty good are going to continue to be a wide receiver 3 and not just to fill in? This isn't Marquise Goodwin filling in for DK Metcalf, right? This isn't, we didn't talk about Paris Campbell. Paris Campbell's had 21 targets over the last 2 games, but now he's going to have Sam Ehlinger, right, under center, and he's got 2 other really good targets on the team that he could have to share with. Wandale, to your point, he's it. Unless there is, a double rainbow sighting of Kadarius Toney, which is essentially what we're waiting on. It might be a triple. Yeah, it might have to be don't you remember that video? It's man, a double rainbow.
Double rainbow.
A triple rainbow. Kadarius Toney may be a triple rainbow. I have a feeling I know what's going to happen, from an artist perspective this weekend as far as what's going to happen with our artwork for the show. There's probably going to be rainbows over our heads somewhere, Marcus, but it's just hard still to find wide receiver 3s that you think can be that for the rest of the season at this point in your fantasy season.
You'll be shocked to know that the guy who made the double rainbow video later admitted to being under the influence of substances. I know that's shocking if you've seen that video there at all. You mentioned Paris Campbell, which seems like a really good pivot at this point because we were all getting excited about Alec Pierce. He seemed like the nice compliment to Michael Pittman Jr. And hey, look, 2 weeks ago, Paris Campbell got 11 targets. We're like, hey, that's really great. That doesn't seem sustainable. Well, the next week he went out and got 12 targets. And it's well, now maybe we have somebody else that we can sort of lean on in Indianapolis. And then, as you mentioned, no more Matt Ryan. Now we get Sam Ehlinger, who is, at least in his NFL career, just a complete mystery box. We have no idea what to expect. So, I think if you're with me, I think you go out and you add Paris Campbell just because of the potential. But I feel like right now it's really hard to play him until we understand more of what Ehlinger brings to that Colts offense.
1,000%. I can't sum it up any better than what you just gave. We got to respect the fact that he's got all these targets in the last 2 weeks. And also, Frank Reich told us this. Okay, this is kind of like the Pete Carroll thing, where he said all of a sudden they were going to run more plays, they were going to go up tempo, and then they did. We actually had Frank Reich tell us the week before this happened, Paris Campbell was really close to being much more involved in the offense. He didn't give us a lot of why or anything like that. So it's kind of okay. Then he came out and did it 1 week. That's nice. Kind of pat Paris Campbell on the head, move him back aside, and then he does it again. But because of the other factors you mentioned, we've got Sam Ehlinger, we have no clue what this is going to be. My gut would say they're going to try to go back to running the football. I think they're going to try to go back to making that their identity. Frank Reich this offseason said, we know we can't just win these games trying to run all the time. We got to throw more. Now, game scripts have dictated it this year, but I think he has a bad taste in his mouth now after everything that's happened. He tried to go more to this pass-heavy approach, somewhat again forced, but it hasn't worked out. He's got Jonathan Taylor, who he has not gotten on track, still has an offensive line, not as good as what it used to be, but still a good offensive line. And when you look around and you see teams like the Giants winning the way they're winning, you look around, you see the Titans winning the way they're winning. If you've got a team that's built the way this team is, like, it may make the most sense, right? You look at Arthur Smith and the way that, the Falcons have been able to squeeze out those games despite not passing. I think that weighs on coaches, Marcus. I think they look around and see, that's what I wanted to do. And I could probably be winning 2 or 3 more games because I wouldn't be turning the ball over. I think they're going to go back to a run-heavy approach. They're going to try to protect Ellinger, and they at the same time want to see what they have in their young quarterback.
Yeah, you talk about it being a copycat league. Certainly, I think that applies to it. And it's funny you say that. Living out here, I had the chance to listen to the Chargers radio broadcast, and Daniel Jeremiah, who does such a great job with draft coverage, also happens to be the color analyst for Chargers radio broadcast. And the thing he always says is it's almost a tried and true guarantee that anytime a quarterback throws a pass that is nearly intercepted and somehow gets away with it for whatever reason, 99% of the time, the next play is a run. And I think if you have a quarterback who is constantly turning the football over, is causing you to lose games, then I think you do look as a head coach and you're like, maybe we should just try running the football and seeing how that works. And I think that's what you're looking at in Indianapolis after Matt Ryan has been so awful to start the year, has been a turnover machine. And you've got a guy like Jonathan Taylor in that backfield. I do think it's an easy pivot for Frank Reich to say, you know what? Let's see what our running back can do. Let's try and avoid some of these turnovers and maybe shorten some games if we can, and see if we can get some wins there.
And let's be honest, Frank Reich needs to just do it his way, probably, because he's probably getting fired. So he's got to turn it around. And once you're backed into that corner, you may as well just do it, the way that you think is going to work best. We're probably not going to like it for fantasy, for right. Michael Pittman. Probably not going to like it for Paris Campbell. Probably not going to like it for Alec Pierce. But Jonathan Taylor, managers, you're going to probably love it.
I mean, if you're going to go down swinging, do it on your terms, right? Not on somebody else's terms.
And we're not necessarily saying it's right. The best approach would be, balanced, and trying to find a way to win, each game. But teams are all built differently, and these coaches, we've talked about it, like, they are smart. Like, most of them are not idiots, as much as we may, give them a hard time. And, we're sitting here, at least me, nerd, you're not a nerd, Marcus, but I am, like, sitting here looking at my spreadsheet. Like, look, there's so much other stuff going into these game plans. So I would expect to see a big shift in the way that they're playing football.
Speaking of game plans, this brings us to the part of the show where we ask, WTF are you doing, Arthur Smith? Which seems to be a kind of a weekly segment. We
should get this sponsored. That should be a sponsored segment. Come on.
Absolutely. Yeah, Jordan,
our producer. Yeah, come on.
WTF are you doing, Arthur Smith? It was one thing when they weren't throwing the football, but they were either winning games or at least they were staying close in games. And you're like, okay, we don't like it, but it seems to be a formula that's working out for Atlanta. This past week, it was 5 minutes into the second quarter. They were down 21-0. By the end of the game, they had thrown 13 passes. They had completed 8. I mean, I think a lot of us have long since decided that, we understand Kyle Pitts is not going to have the year that we all anticipated. Drake London is not going to have the season that a lot of us anticipated. But I'm also, I'm at a point where I don't feel like I can drop either of them. Certainly not Kyle Pitts, but I don't feel like I can drop Drake London. But I can't feel good about starting either one of those guys because it's obvious that Arthur Smith doesn't trust his quarterback to throw the football right now.
Yeah. Let's give some people some relief. If you're playing in an 8-team league, you have permission. Just dump them if you haven't already. You probably have because because of the options that were on the wire, right? If you're playing in a 10-team league that doesn't have super deep benches, you can move forward. Now, again, you want to make sure you've got something that you don't want to just drop. I would not drop Drake London, for example, to pick up Paris Campbell. I would still just hold Drake London. Like, that would be my move. But if you wanted to do it for Wandale Robinson, I might go ahead and do it. Like, because we know what Wandale's going to be. He's at least going to be a wide receiver 3. Is Drake London's talent profile better than that? Yeah. Drake London will probably be a wide receiver 1 in fantasy football within the next 3 seasons, based on what we've seen. This dude has been gangbusters out of the gate. But to your point, Marcus, like, this coaching staff is doing everything they can to take. We always talk about talent having outs, right? And they still do. But these coaches, like, they're slamming the door like on every out possible. And our hope was, let's see Atlanta, who'd been pretty lucky with turnovers, field position, a lot of things working their way to help keep games manageable and help keep the game plan that Arthur Smith likes viable. We wanted to see a game where they were to get into a deep trailing situation and make them open up the playbook. We saw it. They didn't do it. And so I think at this point, like, yeah, you got to move forward. So in a 10-team league that doesn't have a deep bench, I think you can also move forward from both of these players. Again, you want to make it for something good. If you're playing in a 12-team league, 14-team league, deep bench leagues, like you can't drop London, you can't drop Pitts, because there's still a chance that if Arthur Smith loses 2 more games playing his style of football, and now he's getting grilled by the media, he's a human being still. There's a chance that he will change his mind and they could just be like, screw it, I'm going to Ritter now. I want to see what I have in Ritter. Thought we were going to win, thought we were going to contend. We're not. Now I just want to see what I have in Ritter. His priorities change, right, at that moment. His idea of what, success looks like for the season change. The conversation he and the general manager are now having about 2023 now change. Because all of a sudden, if you're not really contending, what's the thing you need to know? Is my quarterback good? I need to let my quarterback, Desmond Ritter, throw the football. So there are outs. That's really your out at this point. We need the Falcons to lose another 1 or 2 games in a row. Sorry if you're a Falcons fan. I'm not against you. Fine. Hope they win. But if you care about London, if you care about Pitts, that's what we need, because we need them in a scenario where Desmond Ritter needs to play and they want to see him throw the football to evaluate what they have. That is the path to upside for London and Pitts. So they have an out. It's getting late though. It's getting late, Marcus.
It's getting late awfully early out there, I think was a Yogi Berra.
Yes.
Okay, so then in a vacuum, if I give you a choice between Kyle Pitts or Greg Dulcich, which way are you leaning right now?
I'm still leaning to Pitts. Because if Dulcich played in a good offense with what we've seen, I would totally go Dulcich. But he also plays in a crappy offense. That's honestly just as bad. It's just as bad. Now, what he's doing, like if you play Dynasty, like Greg Dulcich, do what you can to go get him. Like to already be out there, 71% of the routes this last week, 80% the week before. He had a 20% target share this last game. He's already doing some things. Like Greg Dulcich, it's only 2 data points, but again, you got to act fast. Some of these things you wait. In fantasy football, if you wait until you really have a trend, I get a lot of replies on Twitter, yeah, but. And I'm like, the yeah, buts equal you don't get the player. And I know we could be wrong. And you could come back next week and be like, man, you gave me this advice and it sucked. And I acknowledge that. And I miss on things. But you have to move early if you don't want to, pay a lot, right, to get something. If you want Greg Dulcich, you got to go get him right now. But I would stick with Pitts, because I think Pitts' talent profile, Marcus, is still elite. His targets per route run, everything this year about, Pitts is still great. It's just he plays in an offense that we don't like. So eventually Pitts is going to be a monster in Dynasty. I'm still a believer in that.
I was thinking about this earlier today, that I think I'm kind of just fast forwarding to next year, right? And I know that we'll get to next season and there will be more excitement, there will be more hype, there'll be more people trying to convince people to draft Kyle Pitts. And I just know that the general public is going to look and be
They're
like,
going to say,
nah, there's like, we're out.
But people get worn down, and what happens is ADP, because the people that are buying into that, guess what? They're the people that draft sooner, right? People that will buy into the data and the logic and all those things that are trying to get ahead on curves and things, they'll start buying Kyle Pitts. They'll start drafting him earlier. We saw it with Saquon this last year.
Yeah.
I remember when my first tweet about Saquon in the offseason, I got destroyed. You're a freaking moron. You're an idiot. All Saquon Barkley does is get hurt. And guess what? By the time we got to August, by the time we got to September drafts, Saquon Barkley was what? A 2nd-round draft pick. He had been a 4th-round pick. The same thing happened with CMC. Everybody's like, you are a complete moron. There's no way CMC will be a top 3 pick. But once you sit down, which fantasy analysts, we may not always get things right, but we're typically sitting down and we're working through the data. We're working through projections. We're figuring out, okay, and you get done with it and you're like, well, crap, what am I going to do with CMC? If he's healthy, there's no way he's not going to be in the top 3. And so, other people come along with that thought process as it goes. So I agree with you. What I do think is Pitts won't get as high this next year, because there will still always be, it's the burn me once kind of thing. It's like, okay, fine. Shame on you. Burn me twice. Shame on me. People will take more accountability, and certain people will take a hardline approach on a player, right? And just be like, I'm not drafting Kyle Pitts. Kyle Pitts screwed me. People take things personally in fantasy.
yes.
Kyle Pitts screwed me personally 2 years in a row. I'm not drafting him. And so there will be a big enough segment of the population. There's no way he gets steamed the way he was last year. Now, London, people will probably be able to paint a rosy enough picture. They'll be like, okay, they'll probably be in on London. But I think Pitts will be a great example of where his ADP won't reach the heights that we saw last year, unless somehow Arthur Smith completely fails and gets fired before next season.
Which, look, I will fully admit that I'm going to be back in on Kyle Pitts because I think everything is too good to not be in. There's just that one thing of the Falcons offense just not throwing the football. Everything else really lines up in his favor. So I will sit here and tell you in late October that when we get back to next spring and summer, I will totally be back in on Kyle Pitts next year. I have no problem saying that. Let's kind of check in though as we get ready to wrap up the show on some guys who are having really good seasons or at least playing really well right now. And Joe Burrow, the Bengals got off to kind of a slow start. The first couple of weeks were not particularly great. Although to his credit, Burrow never really panicked. He was pretty cool about it. He said, we'll figure this thing out, and they really have figured it out. I mean, the huge game he had last week with I think 350 passing yards in the first half. So now are we back to a point where we're talking about Joe Burrow as a top 5 quarterback the rest of the season?
I think we are. Here's the biggest change is that over the last few games, we've really seen the Bengals, brain trust Zach Taylor. I'll often accuse of, brain trust, like the word brain and Zach Taylor aren't even often mentioned, together. But to his credit, they have moved to a pass heavy approach in neutral scripts. So that tells us that they probably want their identity to be around the passing game. That is what they did in Joe Burrow's rookie season. Last year, maybe tied to the bad knee injury that he had early on. They did not do that. The later the season got into the playoffs, they went back to being more of that, pass heavy team. Early this season, not quite as much. And so they were okay. They were not bad. They were definitely not a run heavy team or anything, but they would just still do weird things that we were just like, man, really? Like you're running the ball there when you have all these receivers and you have the quarterback. It seems like they've pretty much just decided we're going to live and die with Joe Burrow and with these weapons. And that's the right call. That's the strength of your offense. That's the strength of your team, and being able that allows you to keep up in any game, that allows you to come back in any game, that allows you to establish big leads that make your defense better. It makes everything work. So I think the trends that we've seen from the coaching staff and the fact that they've thawed and decided that, okay, we're just going to be this pass heavy team. I think that makes Joe Burrow. That's what puts him in the top 5. That was my only question about Joe Burrow coming into this season was, how's the coaching staff going to handle it? Are they going to be more conservative like they were at the beginning of last year? Or are we going to see more of what we saw at the end of the year when they made their run to the Super Bowl? Oh, by the way, got a little bit too conservative in the Super Bowl again, but I think that's the way we're headed. So how do you feel about him?
No, I definitely think that. Dan Hansis, who does a great job at Around the NFL, tweeted like a week or two ago. He said, Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase was a lot more fun when it wasn't just, 8-yard plays, 8-yard completions. And now we have seen them go back to being that more explosive offense. And I think that's why we sort of fell in love with that passing game. That's why we wanted parts. That's why we wanted Chase and we wanted Higgins and we wanted Burrow, because we wanted that explosive big chunk plays. And so I think as long as they continue to do that, they are the team that won the AFC last year. And they are the team that can come back and make a deep playoff run again this year. So I'm also in favor of us just adding more quarterback depth, right? Like it's nice if you've got Allen, Hurts, or Lamar Jackson or Patrick Mahomes, but look, that only one team.
But walking into a game with Burrow right now, like you don't feel at a huge disadvantage anymore.
Yes.
I'll be honest, like I would take him over Patrick Mahomes right now. Like his weapons are just way better. Like I love Patrick Mahomes, but if I had to pick between the two, I think I would just go with Burrow. I mean, it's pretty straightforward for me. It's just Jamar Chase is 1,000 times better than MVS. T. Higgins is 1,000 times better than Juju Smith-Schuster. Really what we should do is say, well, Kelsey, right, is his number one. But right. Even then, like Jamar Chase, he can score from anywhere at any time. We love Kelsey, but he can't do that, right? He's a great mismatch. You can't stop Travis Kelsey. You can only hope to contain him, but you just have better weapons. And so I think both are good quarterbacks. Patrick Mahomes is a better quarterback overall. If you put Patrick Mahomes in Cincinnati, like it wouldn't be a conversation. Joe Burrow probably could not elevate the receivers in Kansas City as well as what we've seen with Mahomes. I can be wrong about that. Like, both are really good players. Like, we're kind of splitting hairs here, but like with two guys that are that close, I'm going to take the one that's got the better weapons. I just think there's more upside.
Yeah, there's more depth, I think, in the weapons there, and there's more consistency. Like Juju has been
Tyler
nice.
Boyd's probably better than Juju Smith-Schuster. So
I keep saying,
at worst, they're equal.
Yeah, I keep saying Tyler Boyd he's Woody from Toy Story, right? Like he was the toy that everybody loved, and then all of a sudden, Buzz Lightyear shows up in the form of Jamar Chase, and everybody kind of forgets about Tyler Boyd. But we were reminded last week that Tyler Boyd is still a really good football player, so we shouldn't overlook him. Josh Jacobs is a guy that, in some of my other social media posts and my other work, I have had to formally apologize to, because I didn't think much of him. I avoided him in a lot of spots. I just felt like there weren't going to be opportunities. And you talked about it earlier in this show. No more fear of anybody else behind him. I mean, this really is the Josh Jacobs show. 3 straight weeks with 30 plus points. My buddy Michael F. Florio says he's probably a top 5 running back. Is that crazy?
No, I don't think so. I think you make an argument for Josh Jacobs number 1 overall. I mean, I think that's Eckler, right? But I think number 2 right now you could make as Jacobs, because Saquon Barkley is a better player, but the Raiders are a better offense. The Raiders are 5th in the percentage of their drives that they convert into touchdowns. They're 5th in the league. They're number 1 in the percentage of drives that convert to points. And the big thing with Josh Jacobs, man, 100% of the 2-minute offense worked last week. This is just stuff we never saw before from Josh Jacobs. He's getting not just getting some of the passing down work, like he's getting the majority of it. He's getting a little bit of rest on long down and distance work, but he's on a good team. Their offensive line is playing well. He's playing at a highly efficient clip, and the utilization is just pristine. So there's not a hole in Josh Jacobs' game. What I will say, and we'll talk about this, in a minute, but I'm just going to go ahead and say it here, Marcus. Zamir White should be on, if you're playing in one of those 14, 12 team leagues, he should be on your roster, because now we've seen Josh McDaniels. He's willing to use one back. And I do believe Zamir White is the direct handcuff to Josh Jacobs. Now, if Zamir White were to take over, does that mean all of a sudden Amir Abdullah doesn't get the 2-minute offense? That could happen. In fact, it probably would out of the gate. Like we would see another back, Brandon Bolden, someone get some of the passing down work. But even just if you're getting the workload that Josh Jacobs was getting early in the season, which was he was not getting the passing down work, but he was still getting 75 to 80% of the rushing attempts, that's immediately going to make Zamir White an RB2. Then if he works his way into some of the passing downs, like what we saw with Jacobs, that may not happen, but we now know it's in the range of outcomes. Josh McDaniels might allow it to happen if he's playing really well. Like, I think looking across, like if you're looking for a super deep league kind of stash that's available in 98% of Yahoo leagues, you can get this guy for nothing in your waiver wire bid tonight. Man, like, he's a guy we're not talking about, and there's huge upside there if something happens to Jacobs. Yeah, knock on wood. This was a Josh Jacobs segment. We want him to be awesome. We love him. But if something happened, and when you get a workload like he's getting, it opens up the door to injury.
Well, and I think that's sort of the point, right? Because we went from, in a lot of those leagues where Zamir White either was drafted or at least was being considered to be drafted, to like now we've sort of gotten away from him. But look, we've seen, unfortunately, we've seen the Breece Hall injury. We've seen Rashad Penny's injury. So, while we don't wish it, we don't want it to happen, the reality is it could happen. And so sort of being prepared for the rest of the way is sort of important. Another guy potentially I know that you like to stash, Jameson Williams. And this is a guy that I have on a couple of leagues where I have IR spots, and I drafted him. I dropped him right there, and I've just been holding on and waiting. I know the Lions offense has not been quite as high powered the last few weeks, but some of that's also been the defenses they've been playing. But there does seem to be room for Jameson Williams when he's healthy and ready to go in an offense that still can move the ball and score a lot of points. He does seem like a really nice stash for the last part of the season.
Yeah, we don't know for sure when he's going to come back, but I think Jameson Williams is a guy that you're at the point in the season, especially like you said, if you've got the IR spot, you got to get him. You go get him right now. You put him on the IR. There's probably not a better young candidate to think about that you could use that spot on. But we are also getting close enough that you just want to kind of be ahead of your league mates, because once the news happens on Jameson Williams, and he's available in like 70% of leagues right now. Once the news happens and it's out there, like especially if you're in a league where once your bids run, or your waiver wire just runs for the week, it's just a first come first serve. You need to be the person that gets lucky that you're the first that hears that when they give the timetable that, oh, he's going to be back in 2 weeks. Oh, and it could be that soon. We may not know until exactly he's going to start next week. Right. So you just want to try to be ahead. If you've got a spot that you don't feel really good about, you've got some kind of a player that's just sitting there that you're like, this guy's fine. I'm not using him. He's scoring 6-7 points a game. I can't really use him in that way anyway. I'd rather have some upside. Jameson Williams is a name to consider. One other I would throw at you would be at running back again, be Dearness Johnson. Mm-hmm. And it kind of ties back to what we talked about earlier. If Kareem Hunt gets traded, Dearness Johnson all of a sudden, is now the guy playing the Kareem Hunt role, and he's one step away if something happens to Nick Chubb, being behind a really good offensive line, which we saw him perform really well last year. So Dearness Johnson is another kind of stash guy that's available like a 99% of Yahoo leagues. Those are all names that I like a lot.
Yeah, I think this is the point in the year where, especially if you have a good team and you look like you're in position to make the playoffs, this is the time to go out and kind of stash some of those guys that could potentially help you in the event of an injury or just a change or what happened or what have you, just something to kind of help you keep that depth, maybe give yourself a little bit of an advantage heading into the fantasy postseason. Wow, that was beefy. That was a whole lot of information right there. Hopefully you guys learned something. I always feel like I learn something every time you and I sit down and talk, Dwayne. So I always appreciate that. So enjoy the weather for the next couple of days. I don't know, what is it like down there?
Oh man, the weather is amazing. I actually just went for a little stroll right before we hopped on here today. It's like 68. Mm-hmm. So we're getting some of that California weather. It's I used to go to the West Coast all the time in my job, mm-hmm. and so I was used to work in medical device sales, and so I loved coming to the West Coast, especially. So it kind of reminds me of San Diego right now. Like I feel like I'm in San Diego. We'll get about a week of this. That's what we get in Texas. We go from 100. And then we'll just be 50, so yeah. But right now it's like that perfect it's like that in between weather.
Yeah. I say I'm so blessed living here that I forget that there's weather in other parts of the country sometimes. I walked outside this morning and it was, like 60 degrees. I'm like, ooh, I think I need a hoodie, and I'm sure that people in the Midwest probably are cursing me right now for saying stuff like that.
It's beautiful there, man. I love it.
It's just like, absolutely. I love it. I love it here every day, love it more every day that I live here. Also, loving that you guys listen to this show. We certainly appreciate you. Be sure to go check out the Utilization Report, of course, at fantasylife.com. Plenty of information that we didn't even get to here that you can find there. So it is worth your time to go peruse that while you're there. Check out all the different tools that we have to help you build the best fantasy lineup you possibly can. And be sure to sign up for the absolutely free newsletter as well. In the meantime, we will be back with you later on this week. For Dwayne, I am Marcus. This has been the Fantasy Life Podcast. We appreciate you listening, and we'll talk to you again real soon.